Well, good evening. Good to have you with us tonight. It's good for me to be back as well. I was in Puerto Rico the last week. Well, I guess I should say about 5 days, and we had a good time. So pray for the DeLeons. They'll still be there for about a week, and then they'll be coming back next week. But good time there. You see all the decorations. We're doing day camp this week as well, so I've heard that's been going well. So pray for that. Brooke Morrison's heading that up from Child Evangelism Fellowship. Let's go ahead and take our hymnals tonight. Turn with me to 422, and let's stand and sing Yesterday, Today, Forever, 422. Oh, how sweet the glorious message simple faith may claim. Yesterday, today, forever, Jesus is the same. Still he loves to save the sinful, heal the sick and lame. Cheer the mourner, calm the tempest, glory to his name. Yesterday, today, forever, Jesus is the same. All may change, but Jesus never. Glory to his name. Glory to his name. Glory to his name. All may change, but Jesus never. Glory to his name. He who pardoned erring Peter, never needs thou fear. He who came to faithless Thomas, all thy doubt will clear. He who let the loved disciple on his bosom rest, bids thee still with love as tender lean upon his breast. Yesterday, today, forever, Jesus is the same. All may change, but Jesus never. Glory to his name. Glory to his name. Glory to his name. All may change, but Jesus never. Glory to his name. He who mid the raging billows walked upon the sea, still can hush our wildest tempest as on Galilee. He who wept and prayed in anguish in Gethsemane, drinks with us each cup of trembling in our agony. Yesterday, today, forever, Jesus is the same. All may change, but Jesus never. Glory to his name. Glory to his name. Glory to his name. All may change, but Jesus never. Glory to his name. On the last. As of old he walked to Emmaus with them to abide, so through all life's way he walketh ever near our side. Soon again shall we behold him, hasten, Lord, the day. But we'll still be this same Jesus as he went away. Yesterday, today, forever, Jesus is the same. All may change, but Jesus never. Glory to his name. Glory to his name. Glory to his name. All may change, but Jesus never. Glory to his name. Amen. Good singing tonight. Brother Sam, would you open us in prayer, please?
Thank you, Lord, for the day that we've had, for the rain that you gave us.
Amen. You may be seated. Right across the page, let's sing the Solid Rock 423. 423, we'll sing all 4 verses. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When darkness veils his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. All right, good singing tonight. You can put that aside. And let's take our Bibles, turn with me to Hosea chapter 10. Hosea chapter 10. I want to thank Tom Graham for filling in for me last Wednesday and Sunday. We were able to watch from Puerto Rico on the live stream, and I thought he did a great job. So thank you, Tom, for doing that. Back to Hosea chapter 10 tonight, studying on the theme of having a heart for God. And tonight I'd like to share with you a message that's entitled, A Heart for God Recognizes a Harvest. That there will be a harvest one day. Depending on what you plant, that will determine what kind of harvest you get. And if you recall, a couple weeks ago in Hosea chapter 8, Hosea has already touched on this principle of sowing and reaping. And in that chapter, he warned that they had sown to the wind and they would reap the whirlwind. Perhaps you remember that. Maybe you've heard that verse before. And the idea is that you're going to reap far more than you sow. If you sow to the wind, you will reap the whirlwind. And in this case, the wind kind of represented vanity, emptiness, worthlessness, and they would reap not just merely worthlessness, but they would reap destruction, because when a whirlwind comes, it destroys. Actually, fairly interesting, when we were in Puerto Rico, we saw some of the devastation from the hurricane that they had years ago. I think it was 2018, maybe 2019, and there's still a lot of houses boarded up and a lot of cars just abandoned, perhaps because of flood damage or whatnot. And so you just kind of see, again, the devastation that a whirlwind can produce. Well, because Israel was sowing to the wind, they would reap the whirlwind. But now here in chapter 10, Hosea develops this metaphor of sowing and reaping the harvest, and he develops it more fully. So God had tamed Israel as if she were a ox that was to be used for the purpose of planting and plowing and sowing and reaping. And we find that he had tamed her like a domesticated ox so that she would accept his yoke to accomplish his service, his work, and to plow his field and to produce good fruit. However, we saw back in chapter 4 that Israel slid back like a backsliding heifer. In other words, she didn't want to accept the yoke upon her shoulders, and so she backed up, trying to get out from under that yoke. And we also, again, have noticed that perhaps thinking of Israel and Judah, the southern kingdom, being yoked together, they were constantly fighting, Judah and Israel, back and forth, and so they weren't going to get much work accomplished that way. And then also, God tried to plow with Israel, and yet we'll find in this chapter that she was trying to plow 2 furrows at once. So think about that. What you're supposed to be doing is plowing 1 furrow in a straight line, but she was over here, and then she was over here, and then she was over here, and you can't really plow a straight furrow if you're trying to plow 2 furrows at the same time. And then she, with this plowing, planted the seed of idolatry. And so we'll find that by planting the seed of idolatry, it produced the fruit that lies produce, because idolatry is a lie. It's not a genuine God that one would be worshiping. It's a manufactured or created God. And so this would produce a terrible harvest. And we're going to see some of that harvest described for us tonight. So this would be our main truth here in Hosea 10, because we will reap what we sow. We know that's a New Testament principle as well. Galatians, we should beware what we are sowing. And we might think it's just a small thing, it's a small sin, but you know, small seeds of sin grow into large, big harvests of sin and consequence. So what kind of harvest could Israel expect from their sowing? Well, tonight we're going to see that God reveals that Israel would expect a harvest of crops, including a harvest of disruption. That's in verses 1 through 4. Number 1, a harvest of disruption. Secondly, we'll find in verses 5 through 10, a harvest of disgrace. Disgrace. Number 2, a harvest of disgrace. And then finally, we'll find in verses 11 through 15, a harvest, number 3, of destruction. A harvest of destruction. Those are 3 crops you don't want to produce. You don't want to harvest. And yet, because of their idolatry and their adultery, spiritual adultery, they would reap the harvest of disruption, disgrace, and destruction. Let's begin with prayer tonight as we look at these 3 crops that would be part of Israel's harvest. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that as we look into this passage tonight, that you'll help us to think about the harvest that we may have one day, depending on what we are sowing right now. Father, I pray that we would be really mindful of even small sins, even small habits that are forming, and Father, maybe influences that we are accepting or that we are placing upon others around us. Father, help us to really think through what kind of harvest we can expect to harvest or reap if we continue to plant these actions. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, let's take a look tonight first at number 1, a harvest of disruption. And I think that we'll see that this does kind of progress from inconvenient to absolutely devastating. And so let's begin with this harvest of disruption. We'll find that in verses 1 through 4. Letter A, we'll find verses 1 and 2 here. The blank is the faults. The faults. What were Israel's faults that were going to bring about a damaging or a disruptive harvest? Okay, take a look at letter A, the faults, verses 1 and 2. It says, Israel is an empty vine. He bringeth forth fruit unto himself. According to the multitude of his fruit, he hath increased the altars. According to the goodness of his land, they have made goodly images. We'll stop there for a moment. We find here that God is comparing Israel to a vine, thinking of a vine that would produce probably grapes. And this particular vine, it is starting to produce fruit, because notice it says it bringeth forth fruit unto himself. But before the fruit is able to ripen, before it's able to be harvested, it seems as if the vine just drops the fruit, drops the grapes as a plant sometimes does when it's not properly watered or it's not properly given the nutrients that it needs. Something's not right, and it drops the fruit before it ripens. And so it is an empty vine. And what happens if it drops the fruit early? I suppose the fruit would then rot on the soil, and it would feed the plant, but it's not going to feed the owner of the vine, the one who planted the vine. And I think that's kind of the concept here, because Israel was focused on producing fruit not for God, but for itself. And so notice, as it prospered, as it produced more fruit, what did it do with the fruit? The fruit increased, but then as the fruit increased, it also increased its altars. Now, these would not be altars to worship God. These would be altars to Baal or Ashtaroth or other false gods. And so as they were prospering, their prosperity was being turned towards themselves to serve their own desires, their own passions, their own lusts, and to worship false gods. So this was not a good scene. This was a compounding problem. Notice then, according to the goodness of his land, so this was a good land. Remember, God brought them to a land that was flowing with milk and honey, and which would produce all sorts of good crops. And yet, it was not producing crops for God or giving God glory for the crops. It was giving glory and worship and praise to these false gods. And notice it says, as their good land continued to produce, they made with that income, with that revenue, goodly images. Images that were made out of maybe gold or silver or other precious stones to basically serve themselves. So this was not what God intended. Notice then verse 2, their heart is divided. Now, when I think about a divided heart, I think of in James chapter 1, where it talks about a double-minded man. He just can't make up his mind. But I also think of Matthew chapter 6, where it says in verses 21 through 24, that if our eyesight is split between laying up for ourselves treasures in heaven or trying to lay up for ourselves treasures on earth, then we're not going to have a focus on that which is eternal, that which is good. We're going to be divided. And notice he then says in verse 24, no man can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon is the deification of money, as if we were worshiping it. And by the way, that's probably the most common deity or idol that people worship today, the god of money. And we find that Israel was enjoying the fruits of their land and the prosperity that it produced, but their heart was divided. They were serving Baal, and on the other hand, they were acting or saying that they were willing to serve God, but they couldn't serve both at the same time. Notice, now shall they be found faulty. So God's going to find them guilty for what they're doing. They're not going to get away with it. They can't assume or act as if they are innocent. These are certainly faults that he will hold them accountable for. Notice, he shall break down their altars. He shall spoil or ravage, destroy their images. So he's going to hold them accountable, and he's not going to let them continue in this path. So let me ask you, as we think about these faults, the faults of idolatry and the divided heart, do you have a divided heart that is trying to serve God on the one side and trying to serve self on the other side? Because really, I think all idolatry comes back to wanting to serve self, wanting to do it our way, wanting to create a deity that lets us do what we want to do. So let me ask then, once again, do you have a divided heart that's trying to serve God, or acts like it wants to serve God, or says it wants to serve God, but actually is trying to serve self? You can't do that. It doesn't work. That would be what the Bible calls spiritual adultery. So let's continue. We see the faults. Let's take a look then, secondly, at the falsehood. Letter B, the falsehood, verses 3 and 4. Take a look there. It says, for now they shall say, we have no king, because we feared not the Lord What then should a king do to us? And so I think that it's referring back to the people of Israel when they did not want to accept God as their king. Remember back in 1 Samuel when they didn't want Samuel to be their judge any longer. They wanted a king like all the other nations, and so they didn't want God as their king. They didn't want to fear God and be following God directly. They wanted a king, and so they got a king. And of course, when David's dynasty was split between his son Solomon's son Rehoboam, and Jeroboam of Ephraim, the northern kingdom, we find that they had kings after their own choice. And no of the northern kings really lasted very long because you would have a couple generations and then somebody would kill that king and a new dynasty would start. And we'll see in a moment in 2 Kings chapter 15 that it produced anarchy, where one king lasted a month and then another king would kill, or somebody would come and kill him and he would become king, and another one lasted 6 months and somebody would come and kill him, and this happened over and over again, especially in 2 Kings 15 towards the end of this northern kingdom. And they got to the point where they recognized none of these kings would be able to protect them or help them from the judgment of God. They were not strong kings, they were not godly kings, and they were just serving themselves. And that's why he says, what then should a king do to us? They were not going to be able to be a ultimately lasting benefit for the nation. Okay, look at verse 4. They have spoken words. I think that's referring to the king or to the people who elected or chose the king. They've spoken words swearing falsely and making a covenant. Thus judgment springeth up as hemlock in the furrows of the field. And so I think one example of this is probably 2 Kings chapter 17, where we find that the final king of the northern kingdom, who was this man named Hoshea, which by the way is the same name as Hosea, the one who wrote our book here, who signed a treaty with the Assyrian king Shalmaneser, but then he wanted to betray that treaty, that covenant, and go and try to get So, the king of Egypt, to help him be able to throw off this alliance or this covenant contract with the king of Assyria. And we find that that's actually ultimately what brought about the invasion of the Assyrian kingdom into the northern kingdom of Israel. And so this not keeping their word is actually what would bring about the destruction of the northern kingdom. Also, it says that this would bring about judgment, ultimately the judgment of God, but it would come through the channel of the Assyrian invasion. Notice, springing up as hemlock. Now, it's not the hemlock that you're thinking of, that we might have hemlock trees. This is talking about the old kind of hemlock. Maybe if you remember, I think it was Julius Caesar, the play that, what's his name? Can't think, yeah, Shakespeare, thank you. Shakespeare wrote, and I believe it was hemlock that was used as a poison to kill a certain character in that story. I think it was Julius Caesar. But so hemlock is kind of a way of describing a poison. It's actually translated a couple different ways as gall or bitterness or poison or hemlock. But so God is saying that instead of growing something wholesome in their fields, there would be these plants that would be springing up that were poisonous. And if they didn't realize what it was, they would harvest it with their food, their grain, and then they would prepare their salad or whatever it was and sit down to eat, and that would be the death of them. So notice this would come as part of God's judgment upon them in the furrows of the field. So that's a dangerous place to have poisonous plants. So let me ask you this, as we think about this as part of God's judgment upon them, will you avoid a harvest of God's judgment, a harvest of hemlock, maybe we could say, of poison, and that's what Israel was about to experience. And it was a disruption. There was anarchy in that northern kingdom for the last probably about 30 years or so. It was one king after another, after another, after another. Some lasted 6 months, some lasted 1 month, some lasted 2 years, some lasted a few more years, and it was just a mess. So, as I think about the disruption that was brought because of their selfishness and their idolatry, think about this question: what can cause us to have a divided loyalty? That divided loyalty is what's going to produce this kind of harvest of disruption, and I think we need to think that carefully through. Okay, let's move on to number 2. We'll find here verses 5 through 10, a harvest of disgrace. Number 2, a harvest of disgrace. Okay, take a look at verses 5 through 7 there. Letter A, we'll find there the fear. Letter A, the fear. So what would be Israel's fear? Look at verse number 5. It says, "The inhabitants of Samaria shall fear because of the calves of Bethaven. For the people thereof shall mourn over it, and the priests thereof that rejoiced on it, for the glory thereof, because it is departed from it." Remember that Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. It was built by Omri, the father of Ahab, and so that capital is going to, its inhabitants, is going to have great fear. Now, what's bringing the great fear? Well, notice that there's a reference here to the calves of Bethaven. We saw this earlier in this book, and of course the calves is referring to the calves of Bethel, which 2 Kings tells us were put in place by Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom. But there's a play on words, because Bethel means house of God, but the house of God was no longer worshiping God. They were worshiping golden calves. Bethaven was a nearby town. Bethaven means house of vanity or house of worthlessness. So it's a play on words, substituting the house of Bethel for the house or the calves of Bethaven, meaning that these calves would produce not just worthlessness, but the idea of vanity can also mean emptiness, ruin, devastation. So this would come because of them worshiping these calves, these idols. Notice then, for the people thereof, of Samaria, shall mourn over it. Mourn over Samaria, because Samaria was going to be destroyed. And the priests thereof, remember Jeroboam took of the lowest of the people to make them priests of this cult religion that he said was worshiping God, but it was worshiping God through idols, which of course God said was not acceptable. These priests of Samaria, of the calves thereof, that rejoiced on it, or rejoiced over Samaria, they would not be rejoicing any longer. They would be mourning. Notice why. For the glory thereof, the glory of Samaria, its stronghold, its might, its power, would, notice, depart from it. It would no longer be a stronghold, no longer be the capital of a powerful northern kingdom of Israel. Notice it continues, verse number 6, "It shall be also carried into Assyria for a present to King Jareb." Now, of course, we're talking about a king or the king of Assyria, but the name Jareb was mentioned earlier, chapter 5, verse 13, and it's likely not talking about a name of a king, but it's like an epithet. It's like saying this is a description of the king of Assyria who's going to do this, because the word Jareb means contender or one who fights, and their kings were certainly one who were always waging warfare, and they were very brutal, and so it's likely saying that this king of Assyria is one who would come to fight against Israel. And notice that he's going to carry away into captivity it. And so is that talking about Samaria, or is it talking about the golden calf that Samaria worshipped? Well, probably all of it, because if a kingdom comes in and conquers another kingdom, they don't just take the people captive, they take the gold, the silver, and those golden calves, they're going to take those captive as well, showing that these calves couldn't protect them. They were taken into captivity along with the people who were supposed to be protected by the golden calf that they worshipped. Well, that wasn't going to work out very well. Notice he says, "Ephraim shall receive shame, and Israel," Ephraim the largest tribe of the northern kingdom, and then all of Israel, shall be ashamed of his own counsel. So Israel was going to get into this mess because they were following their own counsel. They thought they knew better than God. They thought they had it all figured out. They were going to make their own worship of their own idols. And this, of course, reminded me of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, where, of course, we're told that we are not going to be able to have God's blessing unless we follow his ways. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Lean not to thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. They didn't do that. They leaned on their own counsel, and it would bring them to the place where they would be invaded by the Assyrian king, and they would all go into captivity. Let's continue. Let's notice verse 7. He says, as for Samaria, her king is cut off as the foam upon the water. Well, foam on the water is not very substantial. You could probably scoop it up and it would just dissolve in your hand. Eventually, the water will probably disperse it. And what is it? It's just bubbles. It's not really anything there that's going to last. And so the word picture here is comparing this king of Samaria as if he were just foam. But I think it's more than just one king, because we're going to see further down in this chapter, this king of Samaria is brought up again, but it's the end of the kings of Samaria, the end of all of the kings of the northern kingdom. There's not going to be any more kings after that. And so this is the final conclusion to that northern kingdom and to the kings of the northern kingdom. I think that this, of course, as I mentioned, refers back to one of the kings, Menahem, 2 Kings chapter 15, where he tried to establish some kind of treaty with the king of Assyria, and it would bring about his demise, because the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser, would see the wealth of the northern kingdom and figure even if he got paid off, he wasn't going to just keep that. He wanted to come back and have more and have all of what was found in the northern kingdom. So it would become an embarrassment to Israel because of their foolishness and their shame. And their kings, as I mentioned, would disappear. So let me ask you this: will you avoid the embarrassment that following your own counsel brings? In the moment, we may feel like we've got it all figured out and we know exactly what we're going to do, but following our own counsel, our own wisdom, is only going to bring about shame and embarrassment and destruction. Okay, let's take a look then at verses 8 through 10. We're going to find here, letter B, that Hosea is going to kind of introduce more of this idea of harvesting, sowing, and reaping. And so take a look then at verse 8. We'll pick it up there. Letter B is the furrows. Furrows is referring to that trough that you create as you plow the soil, that line where you plant the grain. Verse number 8 says, the high places also of Aven. By the way, notice how Beth Aven and Aven here, there's a connection there. Aven means worthlessness or vanity or emptiness. These are the high places where they would come and worship the calves, worship the idols. They were the sin of Israel. The high places also of Aven, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. So these high places, which were meant to provide protection for the kingdom, they would be destroyed. They would be ruined and empty and wasted. The thorn and the thistle shall come up on their altars. Well, they wanted the altars to be a place that were frequented for sacrifices, but they would be destroyed, they would be abandoned. There would be thorns and thistles that would come up and overgrow them, so that they, of course, couldn't be used, had not been used. And notice, and they shall say to the mountains, that would be the inhabitants of Samaria, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. They would prefer death on their own terms, in that quick, swift way of an earthquake crushing them, rather than to be captured by the Assyrians and have to endure maybe torture or maybe being in bondage and captivity. And so, of course, this reminded me of Luke 23, verse 30, during the tribulation, when people will also ask mountains to fall on them and the hills to cover them, which is an expression of great despair and great concern, because they would rather die then endure the life that they would have in this particular captivity. Okay, then take a look then at verse number 9. It says, O Israel, thou hast sinned from the days of Gibeah. There they stood. The battle in Gibeah against the children of iniquity did not overtake them. This is a reference to Judges chapter 19. Earlier, I think it was 2 or 3 chapters ago, Hosea referenced this situation also. And again, not something you would read for family devotions, but if you take a look there at some point, Judges 19 talks about the great evil. It was the sin of homosexuality that the Gibeonites tried to do with the one man and his concubine, and what happened there. Chapter 20, chapter 21, we find that when that was done, the man tries to gather all of the other tribes to come and to punish Gibeah, but the whole tribe of Benjamin, of which Gibeah was a part, banded together, and they fought against Israel and Judah and all of the other tribes. And Benjamin was able to push back all of the other tribes twice, until finally God gave the other tribes victory, but not full victory, because they said they were going to kill all of the Benjamites, but I believe it was 600 who were left, and so wickedness was not fully stamped out. And that's what it's talking about here. The children of iniquity did not overtake them. The battle that was done. So the illusion, or the symbol, the illustration is that sin and wickedness was allowed to endure. And it had endured in Israel up to the current time. And there were even, as we know, others in the northern kingdom and even some in the southern kingdom that were committing the same sins, even the sin of sodomy and homosexuality in these kingdoms of northern and southern Israel. So God was going to punish them for that. All right, then take a look at verse number 10. He says, It is my desire that I should chastise them, and the people shall be gathered against them when they shall bind themselves in their 2 furrows. And so God desires to correct and to discipline Israel. And so how was he going to do that? Well, he was going to gather people against them. Notice, the people shall be gathered against them, speaking of the inhabitants of Samaria. And this is talking about a siege, where the city would be surrounded and they would be destroyed. And of course, the reminder to us is that we need to be aware that there will be a consequence. There will be a reaping what we have sown. And then finally he says here, when they shall bind themselves in their 2 furrows. This idea of binding is the idea of the yoke being put upon the 2 ox. But as these 2 ox are plowing the furrows, they're not plowing one furrow in a straight line. They're back and forth from one furrow to the next, going between 2 opinions, Baal and God. And so just as we mentioned further up there, when they had a divided heart, here they have 2 different furrows that they're trying to plow in, and that produces great confusion. Well, this reminded me of 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21, where Elijah asks the people of Israel how long they will halt or kind of start and stop between 2 opinions. It says there, and Elijah came unto the people and said, How long halt ye between 2 opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And so Elijah's point is, you can't continue to act like you're serving God and then serve Baal, and then act like you're serving Baal, but then be like, no, I'm going to serve God. You can't live like that. You can't serve God and Mammon. You can't serve God and Baal. It also reminded me of Joshua 24:15, where Joshua says, And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So, each one of us has to make a decision. We can't halt between two opinions. We can't serve God one day and serve self the next day and then go back to serving God the third day. It doesn't work like that. We have to make a decision for ourselves and for our families what direction we're going to go. And so Joshua and Elijah were asking that question, and Israel needed to settle that once and for all. So are you trying to live for the world and trying to live for God at the same time? It doesn't work. It's impossible. You can't serve God and mammon. So ask this question: what can keep our heart from a divided loyalty? What can help us not to have a division in our loyalty where we're trying to plow two different furrows at the same time? Lastly, let's take a look at number 3, verses 11 through 15, a harvest of destruction. We've seen a harvest of disruption, a harvest of disgrace, and now a harvest of destruction. So take a look at verse 11 through 13. We'll find here letter A, the farm. We're going to come down to the farm once again. We've talked about the vines, we've talked about the furrows, we've talked about multiple images of the farm, but now we're going to get even more specific. Take a look at verse 11. So letter A is the farm. And Ephraim is an heifer. You know, you don't want to call people heifers very often, but for illustration purposes, Hosea is saying that the northern kingdom, illustrated by the largest tribe of the northern kingdom, which is Ephraim, it is an heifer. And this heifer, this female cow, was taught. Notice, taught, and that would be the idea of tamed, trained to be able to be useful to the farmer. And notice what this cow liked to do. It loved to tread out the corn. Why do you think it loved to tread out the corn? Well, Deuteronomy chapter number 25 tells us that in verse 4, when an ox was treading out the corn, Israel was not supposed to muzzle the ox so that it could continue to, take a mouthful of grain while it was treading out the corn. That was the ox's favorite job. But there was more that the ox was supposed to do. So take a look then at verse number 11. It says, he loved to tread out the corn. What ox wouldn't want to tread out the corn? But I passed over upon her fair neck. Talking about the heifer and God trying to put his yoke across the neck of the heifer. And he's speaking gently to the heifer, saying that she has a nice fair neck. And but notice, even as this was seeking to be done, Ephraim did not like to do that job, didn't want to have the yoke upon it. Notice it says, I will make Ephraim to ride. This idea of ride would be to put the harness upon the ox so that it could pull the cart or maybe pull the plow. He continues on, Judah shall plow. So Ephraim, the northern kingdom, largest tribe, Judah, the southern kingdom, largest tribe, both of them are supposed to be plowing together in this yoke. And then he also references Jacob, referring to the entire nation, all 12 tribes, shall break his clods, referring to the hard pieces of soil that needed to be broken up. And so this is talking about all the different jobs that these two oxen of Israel and Judah were supposed to accomplish for God, the farmer. And they were supposed to be doing these things, and they weren't really doing that now, but notice the future tense. I will make Ephraim to ride, shall plow, shall break his clod. So I think this is looking ahead when one day both kingdoms will plow together, they will produce God's fruit, they will serve God as they should. But then take a look at verse 12. He says, sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap in mercy. Once again, we find that we will reap what we sow. If we sow righteousness, we can expect to reap mercy from God. He continues, he says, break up your fallow ground. Fallow ground would be hard ground. Remember the sower of the seed in the New Testament? You can't sow the seed upon hard ground because the birds come and they will snatch the seed away and eat it. It needs to be sown onto plowed ground, prepared ground. And so we're supposed to break up the fallow ground. Notice, for it is time to seek the Lord till he come and rain righteousness upon you. If we seek the Lord, then God will come. He'll bring the rain, which can cause the seed to sprout, which will produce the fruit, not a bad fruit, a poisonous fruit, but a fruit of righteousness. And that's the kind of fruit that we really want. It's going to be a blessing to us, a blessing to others. This reminded me of Jeremiah 4. Maybe you thought of this as well. Jeremiah 4, 3 and 4, where it says, break up, speaking to Judah, the southern kingdom, your fallow ground, sow not among thorns. The idea, once again, is don't sow the seed among the thorns where it will get choked by the cares of this world, but sow it among plowed ground, prepared ground, where it will grow good fruit. But now let's take a look at the alternative. Verse number 13, ye have plowed wickedness. They were supposed to be planting righteousness, but instead they plowed wickedness, and notice, what did they reap because of it? They reaped iniquity. It's almost a compounding of the wickedness, producing greater wickedness. Ye have eaten the fruit of lies. So when they lied to themselves and worshipped idols, it produced the fruit of lies, which was more wickedness, more devastation, more destruction. He continues, because thou didst trust in thy way, in the multitude of thy mighty men. Remember, they were not trusting in God's way. They were trusting in their own counsel, verse 6. They were trusting in their own way, verse 13. They were trusting in their mighty men, thinking that they would give them victory, that they would protect them from the invasion of the Assyrians. But no, that would not actually work. So I think the reminder to us here is that it's better for us to have God's yoke upon us than the yoke of the tyrant, of the Assyrian invader. That reminded me, of course, of Matthew 11, where it says in verse 28 through 30, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You know, I want us to remember that it's better to be under God's yoke, because then we will bear good fruit. Will you accept God's yoke, which is His way of living, the restrictions that He places upon us, the ways that He wants us to live, so that we can produce good fruit? All right, finally, let's take a look at verses 14 and 15. We'll find here the fall. Letter B is the fall, the final destruction of the northern kingdom. Look at verse number 14. It says here, therefore, because of them plowing wickedness and reaping iniquity, producing the fruit of lies, because of that choice, therefore shall a tumult arise among the people. This word for tumult has the idea of a panic. It's going to be messy. It's going to be disruption. It's going to be running for your life because of the invasion of the Assyrians. There will be a tumult among the people, and all thy fortresses shall be spoiled. Those fortified cities that they thought would protect them from the invasion, they would be spoiled, ravaged. Then notice it says, as Shalman. Shalman is a shortened form of Shalmaneser, which is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 17. He was the Assyrian king that Menahem made a covenant with, that he would not invade. But a little further on, we find that Shalmaneser must have invaded a town nearby called Beth Arbel. Now, some think that possibly Beth Arbel could be a play on words as well, because Beth means house, Arbel means God's ambush. So if this is the house of God's ambush, then this may simply be a reminder to Israel that just as Shalmaneser destroyed other cities, God would bring Shalmaneser to destroy, or perhaps the other Syrian king who would follow after him, Tiglath-Pileser, to destroy the entire kingdom. So take a look then. He says here, Beth Arbel in the day of battle. They needed to learn from what Shalmaneser had already done and realize that this was about to happen to them. And something very graphic, something very sad. The mother, it says, was dashed in pieces upon her children. So the children were killed first, as the mother was watching, and then the mother was killed and thrown with the children. Very graphic, very disturbing, but it's a warning to Israel that if they don't get things right, what happened to Beth Arbel, the house of God's ambush, was going to happen to them. Verse 15, so shall Bethel do unto you. So here, once again, we refer to the house of God, which is the place of the golden calves, and it was the worship of the golden calves in Bethel which would bring about Israel's destruction. Because of your great wickedness, notice, in a morning shall the king of Israel utterly be cut off. The final king of the northern kingdom was Hoshea, and he was, of course, killed, and he was the final king. There was no more kings after him. There was no more restoration of the northern kingdom with a king at some point in the future. There were some from the tribes that migrated south into the southern kingdom, but notice that he would be cut off utterly in the morning, early on, quickly, and that would be the end of that kingdom. So there would be a final fall. The question I have for us is, will you avoid destruction by learning from the fall of others? You know, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. And it's the one who thinks that they are not going to fall, who thinks that they are fully safe, who is going to walk right into a trap. Israel, because of their pride, thought it would never happen to them. You know, I think of kids, in fact, I can remember myself observing my older siblings getting disciplined and thinking, well, I don't want to do what he just did or what she just did because I'm probably going to get the same consequence. Now, that didn't always work because I got in enough trouble on my own, but the point is we should be learning by watching the fall of others to avoid the same fate, avoid making the same decisions that they made to get them into that place. And observation, learning from the mistakes of others, can help protect us from those unfortunate consequences. So why is serving a good master better than serving yourself? Well, it was William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, who said, men must be governed by God or they will be ruled by tyrants. And I think that is very applicable to the nation of Israel. They were not willing to be governed by God, and so they ended up being ruled by tyrants from Assyria. And I think that we can recognize that's a great warning for America as well, as we ask ourselves, will we be ruled by God or ruled by tyrants? Israel listened to its own counsel, threw off God's yoke, and sought merely to serve itself. The result was the removal of God's protection, which then brought the Assyrian invasion. The northern kingdom would lose its national identity, lose its national sovereignty, and lose its independence. The plowing and sowing to the flesh would bring a harvest of disruption, disgrace, and ultimately destruction. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help us tonight to heed the warning of what Israel sowed and what Israel reaped. Father, I pray that we as a nation, but more importantly, we as a church and we as individuals would recognize that what we sow, we will reap. Lord, help us to sow